Hi, Anthony OK, and you're in the stream. Today, Australia's Aboriginal population is struggling with poor health and chronically low education rates. Are they being marginalised? Our digital producer Malika Bilal is away this week, so Omar Butter is filling in. So Omar, hello there.
Hello.
And more importantly, hello Australia. Now, this conversation is all about the Aboriginal community in Australia, the greater community in Australia. What are our Australian community actually saying?
You know, they actually have very strong views, which
Right.
I think is going to make this a very interesting discussion.
Sure.
If you take a look at my screen, we have a video comment from Madison in Australia. Listen to this.
As a non-Indigenous Australian, I believe that most Australians are not aware of the issues that Aboriginal communities face. We rely heavily on negative stereotypes, we act without cultural sensitivity, and our government has failed them. It's a national shame and an international embarrassment, and Australians should be doing more to ensure Aboriginal people finally have their rights in this country.
It's always nice when we kick things off with such a strong statement right off the top.
It's going to be a good conversation.
Yep. Of course, for those of you at home, we want you to join the conversation as well. So be sure to tweet us using the hashtag that you see on your screen right now, AJStream.
Now, Twitter isn't the only way to be part of our program. You can check out our page at stream.aljazeera.com. That is where I am right now. You can see some of the many stories that we're following and also click on our exclusive web content.
My name is Robert Bjarnason, the president of the Citizens Foundation of Iceland, and I'm in the stream.
Australia has two sides, one with a high quality of life and the other with a struggling Aboriginal population. In fact, Indigenous life expectancy is 10 years less than the rest of the population, and remote communities often suffer from chronic kidney and heart disease. Educational levels have improved slightly though, but are still well below those of non-Aboriginals. Back in 2008, the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd made an historic apology to the Aboriginal community. Australia's new Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, has pledged to improve Indigenous lives and is setting up an advisory council. But is that enough? Filmmaker and journalist John Pilger recently compared the plight of first Australians to apartheid South Africa. Take a little clip from his new documentary movie, Utopia.
No more whispering in our mind.
Welfare men found us and took us, and mothers were screaming and crying and hanging onto the truck while they drove us away.
Gonna rise up.
We've got a lot of racist policies in our past, but this one was the mother of them all.
One less loved one at Christmas.
One rule for the whites and one rule for the blacks.
He was just left in his cell to die while police officers searched the
Rise
lab.
up for you now.
So, as Australia begins a new political chapter, is the future brighter for its Aboriginal population? Joining us on our Google Hangout to discuss this and a lot more, Chris Graham. He's a journalist and associate producer on the film Utopia. Tom Calma is a professor and former Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Carla McGrath is Head of Sustainability at the National Centre of Indigenous Excellence. Anthony Dillon is a social scientist at the University of Western Sydney. And joining us on Skype, Tanya Hosh. She is the Deputy Campaign Director of Recognise Australia, which campaigns for constitutional recognition of Indigenous communities. So it is great to have all of you here in our discussion. But let's start off with Chris. Chris, we saw you in that little trailer there for Utopia. I'm also looking on my computer at a John Pilger page that he did, an article that he did for The Guardian. In the lucky country of Australia, apartheid is alive and kicking. You were part of this really huge project, Chris. Can you give us a little bit of insight into what were the living conditions like for some of the Aboriginal communities that you spent time with?
Well, the community of Utopia, which is what the film's partly named about, you would see third world poverty, basically, abject poverty. There's massive overcrowding in houses. You see frequently 20 plus people living in a single two-bedroom house. the health, generally speaking, is very poor, and the average life expectancy across the nation is there's a 10-year gap. But in a community like Utopia, there's an average life expectancy of about 45 years for an Aboriginal male. So very sick, very poor. And while we were actually filming Utopia in Utopia, an Aboriginal man aged 46 died that night while he was sleeping in a humpy, which is a basic tin structure. He died from rheumatic heart disease, which has in that area some of the highest recorded rates on earth. So it's very, very poor.
So I just want to bring in Tom here. Tom, there's a campaign literally called Close the Gap in Australia, and it's about the health differences between some in the Aboriginal community and the rest of Australia. What happens in that gap? Why is there such a big difference?
Well, there's I guess there's no one single answer to that question. And what prompted me in 2005 to compile this report was that the life expectancy for an Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander person in Australia was 17 years gap between us and the rest of Australia. Whereas in other developed countries, the Indigenous peoples of New Zealand, Canada and America only had gaps of about 6 or 7 years. And so the question had to be why do we in Australia enjoy the same life expectancy as people in rural Bangladesh? And that was dying 17 to 20 years younger than the rest of the population.
So you compiled the report, then what conclusions did you come to?
Well, there's a major problem that I think, and what I promoted was that what we're doing was firstly having governments determine policies for the Indigenous peoples rather than involving and engaging with Indigenous people, and so we had to turn it around and follow a developmental model or a human rights-based model, and that was to make people the centre, and so that they had an active engagement in developing up the policies.
So Tom, let's take it out of government speak for just for a moment. So I live in Utopia, okay? I'm part of the Aboriginal community there. What difference does that make to me?
Well, if we go back just a decade ago, there was lack of access to education within that community. There was lack of access to good health services. They have improved a little. Housing, as Chris has mentioned, was still an issue, and in fact, the interesting thing about Utopia is that that community, houses were built for people, but they were constructed in a form that wasn't acceptable to the Aboriginal people because somebody else determined the structure. So they decided to live outdoors and use the houses for storage, which was typical in many of our communities where boxes are built and people are expected to live in them.
Right. I'm going to bring in some of our community and then get back to our guests here as well. Omar.
Yeah, I would like to put a question to Anthony. We have a comment here, if you take a look at my screen, from George. When we put out the question of essentially what's the biggest problem facing the Aboriginal community, George said there is no one issue. They are treated and regarded as second-class citizens, they have no voice, and they are tokenized by the government. Anthony, what is your take on this?
Yeah, look, I would agree with that, but the thing to realise is that applies to some of the Aboriginal people in this country, and we spoke about the gap just a minute ago, the gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. I'm more concerned about the gap between those Aboriginal people who are doing well, such as Tom, myself and many other Aboriginal Australians, and the ones who are the focus of Utopia. So within the Indigenous community, you have this gap between those who are doing well and those who are doing very poorly. So we need to focus on those who are doing poorly and recognise that what you see in a documentary like that or the reports you hear about Aboriginal people, that's not across the board here in Australia. There are many who are doing well, and we should always remember that those, when we see the sensational stories which need to be reported on, that's not applying to all Aboriginal people but a minority of Aboriginal people.
So Carla, the world is watching Australians discuss this right now. Sensational or realistic?
The discussion that we're having at the moment?
Absolutely,
you think,
yeah.
Obviously those statistics are realistic. We are driven every day in the work that many of us do by the lived daily disadvantage of many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across this country. It is not unrealistic or sensationalist at all to say that many people are living in third world conditions across across Australia. What I think the country needs to start to do is, yes, be driven by that disadvantage, but start to change the conversation that we're having around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly our young people. As Tom pointed out, the majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country at the moment are young. More than 60% are under the age of 25. What we need to start doing is having a conversation around those young people that invests in their future in a way that hasn't been done previously, that talks about the resilience that Tanya has discussed earlier that exists within our communities. There could be no way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across this nation could be the oldest surviving cultures in the world without a great deal of resilience. That's success and excellence in a way that isn't discussed when it comes to Indigenous people in this country. So I think having a good and full understanding of the diversity that Anthony's just discussed, and recognising that resilience and talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in that way.
All right, Carla, so let me just ask you, do Australians as a general public, do they understand and appreciate the diversity that's in Australia? Are we talking about this wishful thinking? Are we talking about what's really happening right now?
I don't think the average Australian does know about the diversity within our communities, no.
Tanya, let me bring you into the conversation here. One of the big issues with the Aboriginal communities, the ones that are more remote, health issues. How does that focus on health actually help you in your work, where you're going, okay, we need to be recognised as a group, as a community, as communities in Australia?
I think the health conditions that you would see highlighted in the work that Chris has done with this film Utopia are the kind of problems that are screaming out for a sustained national effort and investment. I think one of the difficulties that we've had with improving the living conditions of the most disadvantaged Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia is that a lot of the work and programs that takes place often have been run on political cycles and haven't necessarily been led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people themselves, which is why the Close the Gap program has been so incredibly important, because it has been largely led by a strong leadership group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I've got a bit of a background in working on Indigenous governance, and one of the things that is really clear both domestically in Australia but also internationally is that when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are empowered and supported to run their own programs in their own communities in ways that make sense for them, then you'll always get improved outcomes. There's no question about that. So give
us an example, because I don't. We're talking very general right now. I really want to connect with real people and real things that are happening. So a program that connects that you know.
Program that connects that I know.
Yeah, because it's easy to talk as generalisations. Yeah,
working in places like Utopia,
right?
But certainly in urban situations, and I live in Adelaide, I can think of a number of programs that are particularly driven out of primary community healthcare centres. We've got really dedicated Aboriginal people working within the health system to connect with communities directly on programs that make sense for them, whether it's about trying to support families to make it easier for them to deal with these, some pretty stunning difficulties when it comes to healthcare, education and just living standards and the cost of living in Australia, particularly if you are disadvantaged, and supporting those families to support other families who are dealing with the same things, where the problem solving that's working in one household can be shared with another, is really impressive work that's happening in South Australia at the moment. And this is where you've got Aboriginal people supporting other Aboriginal people with exactly the same problems, and also just trying to do something about the over-intervention that sometimes occurs where people are in the too hard basket when it comes to their social standing.
Omar.
So one of the big issues that we're dealing with, of course, here, besides health and housing costs and all that, is the issue of education. And on that in particular, there are actually a couple of comments if you take a look at my screen. Katie, who's an Aboriginal Australian, says, it's good when it comes to job opportunities. There's heaps out there for people like me because I have an education, but the majority of our people don't have the education. On the other hand, we have another comment from Eddie who says, the so-called Aboriginal problem is in their own hands. We all have the ability and the free education standards in Australia to advance ourselves. When you give anyone something for nothing, they do not put a value upon it. It must be earned. Chris, what in your view is that, what's your take on what the gap in education, basically, what's responsible for it?
Well, look, it depends where you go. If you go into the Northern Territory, for example, most Aboriginal people living in regional remote areas don't speak English as the first language. They might speak 3 or 4 other languages. Federal and territory governments have ensured that they don't learn in their own languages. There's now, toing and froing on that policy, but in that sort of area, that's why there's a problem. I'm on my way to Walgett today to do a story on a school there, which has a principal who has been blogging privately about Aboriginal children in the most dismissive and appalling terms. And if you ask Aboriginal people, many will say that the education system as constructed by White Australia doesn't meet the needs of Aboriginal students, and it doesn't, and teachers don't meet the personal and cultural needs of Aboriginal students. And that's been the case for a very, very long time in this country.
Tom?
Well, I think, what Eddie doesn't appreciate is the diversity across Australia. We look just back a couple of years ago, the federal government decided to have what they classed as an emergency response legislation or intervention into the Northern Territory because children weren't going to school. But once they did their research and they did a stock take of all the schools, they immediately found that there were 200 teachers short to accommodate all the students. And if all the students turned up, they would not be able to receive an education. So whilst some schools do have capacity, many people living in communities don't. And we shouldn't forget that many of our Aboriginal communities, and say just the Northern Territory where there's over 1,300 Aboriginal communities, they're a construct of previous government's policies where they brought people together and put them into artificial mission communities run by the churches or government institutions. And take, for example, a community like Wadeye in the Northern Territory, where there are 22 different language groups all being thrown into the one community and then expected to live harmoniously, and that is a construct of government that has been very dismissive in the past of the original traditional owners. There are many different cultures operating in that one community, and they're the sort of issues that we have to contend with in many of our remote communities. Urban-based situations are a little different, but it's still, again, the appropriateness of education and the delivery. And I think in New South Wales, as an example, where Chris is working, and one of the teachers he mentioned, they've got a new program called Connected Communities, and they're trialling in about 20 communities a different approach to education, where they're looking at teaching an Aboriginal language, the local Aboriginal language, within to all the school population, right, which is turning the equation around to gain a bit more respect for the original people of the land.
So Anthony, I mean, you brought this up the very first time that we chatted to you, and you were talking about, well, there is a difference in the Aboriginal community, but between the educated and the ones who are struggling to get educated. How would you fix that? You're a university lecturer. You've taught lots of the Aboriginal community.
Yeah, look, this is a difficult question, simply again because of the diversity. First of all, let me start off with a positive. If a person's intelligence is defined as their ability to adapt to problems and an environment, Aboriginal people and say plus Eskimos are the most intelligent people in the world, given that they've lived in incredibly extreme, harsh conditions. So there's this enormous untapped potential among Aboriginal people. They are highly intelligent people, but there's been problems that have prevented them from grasping an education. It's not because they don't want to. there's the day-to-day situations in these remote communities where school education is not a priority. If you live in an environment where you do not see adults working, because there's no jobs for the adults, well then getting an education isn't going to be a priority. So there's many factors that impact on this, and it requires both a long-term and a short-term approach. I think we're heading in the right direction with some of what Tom was just talking about a minute ago, but we certainly need to do more. We need to focus on the positive, and where there are negatives we need to eliminate them and address them.
Sure.
But the message has got to be, look, education is very, very important. And just one other barrier I'd like to just talk about. Sadly, when we talk about education, there are some people who oppose that and see that as assimilation. And we just need to give the message, no, you can be educated and you can still maintain your cultural values.
Omar, what's
I've never heard anybody oppose education, Anthony. Who are you talking about? Never heard a single Aboriginal person oppose education. Name one person.
Chris, on blogs, okay?
On blogs, pretty general, Anthony. Name a prominent Aboriginal person who has opposed education.
A prominent Aboriginal person? No, there isn't a prominent one. I'm just saying.
It hasn't happened.
Mate, just on blogs, you get people who will chuck out those comments, and unfortunately some people may take it seriously and believe it. Overall, the message is positive, that Aboriginal people need education. I'm just saying there are some people out there who will give the wrong message.
Do you know,
sure, and overall, Aboriginal people believe that education is important. It's about how that education is delivered and what education is delivered.
I agree 100%.
Keep telling Aboriginal people what they need to learn. That's part of the problem. But everybody embraces education.
Let me just break this up just for a moment and take you back to a couple of years. So we're going back about 5 years, and this is when there was a national apology to the Aboriginal community, and this is the response that Tom actually gave after the Prime Minister at the time, Kevin Rudd, actually gave this apology. I just want to check back in with Tom to feel how he's feeling right now, but let's go back to that time.
Parliament has now laid the foundations for healing to take place and for a reconciled Australia in which everybody belongs. For today is not just about the stolen generations, it's about all Australians. Today's actions enables every single one of us to move forward together with joint aspirations and a national story that contains a shared past and a future.
So that was back in 2008, Tom? Did I get that date right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you sound optimistic when you were standing there. Now, a couple of years on, how do you feel about where all the very diverse Aboriginal communities are right now?
Look, I think in many ways we are moving forward. The great thing about the apology to the stolen generations was that it created an opportunity for Australia to be educated.
But right now, the feeling right now, because I saw you back there 2008, just to wrap up this part of the show, because we're coming to the end, I really want to tap into right now.
Well, right now I think there's optimism out there. There's still a lot of issues to be challenged. We have a new government. We've yet to see how engaged they will be with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We've got to redirect it away from the government of the day to determine the policies for Indigenous peoples of Australia, and to engage with us and allow us to have direct input and a say. We've got to centre people as the solution to create the solution, because we've got much to offer if we're given the opportunity.
All right, so Tom and Carla and Tanya and Anthony and Chris, 5 people who've got a lot more to say. We're taking them all to the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. Let me head back to the community for one last thought before we do that.
We have a thought that connected the struggle in Australia globally. On my screen, Al-Hajj says, an Indigenous person everywhere is condemned to obscurity, whether it's in Australia, Brazil, Canada, New Zealand, Russia, or the USA.
Now, if we haven't shown your tweet on the bottom of the screen yet, it's not too late. Tweet us at AJStream on Twitter, and then head to the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. Now, what will we be doing on the next show? Well, the killing of a Nigerian man in India has fired up diplomatic tension between the two countries. Nigerians say they face racism and discrimination in India, but Indian authorities blame the murder on local drug feuds. We'll have more on that story tomorrow. But right now, I'll see you online in the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching. Hello again. Welcome back to the Post Show. Today we're discussing Australia's Aboriginal population. I want to get right back to the conversation. I'm just going to check in with the guests though, first of all. Tanya, was that the fastest 30 minutes you've ever had?
It did go fast.
It goes really fast. What have we not talked about, Tanya, that you felt was really critical? When you woke up this morning, apart from the fact that it was so early, and you thought, this is really important that we tackle, because I'm just making a list so that we get to it.
I just think that there's often this expectation that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are supposed to only be concerned with one issue at a time.
Yeah.
That we're only supposed to be concerned with one pressing urgent need, where as a country, any kind of nation, part of the social fabric that makes something cohesive and makes communities cohesive is to make sure that all of these issues are dealt with seriously at the same time. And I think that there's no reason that a country with the wealth and opportunity that Australia has, that we shouldn't continue to strive for that sort of outcome. I find it frustrating that there's an expectation placed on us by people in the community, sometimes through government programs and government leadership, that there's this expectation that we should all just be funneled into one issue and be silent on others. And I think that's why a conversation like this is really important.
Sure. And I'm going to admit, I'm just going to be very honest, it was our challenge in this entire show. It's like when we were talking, Omar, it was, what should we focus on? Because we only have a set amount of time, Tanya and guests. So it was like, okay, health. If you're dying by the time you're 45, I said to Omar, I'd be dead by now if I was in a remote Aboriginal community. Don't laugh. It's serious. Okay, like just thinking about it in that context, and also education, because education seems to be the cure for almost anything, but it is really hard if on a TV show, if we can't do it, how do you do it as an entire country? Carla?
I think you've touched on something really important there, which is really about oftentimes in many of these conversations we are narrowing right down to those health specific outcomes and those education specific outcomes.
Right.
And I guess part of what Tanya's trying to say as well is we need to be looking at the deeper, broader I guess social indicators that feed up into those very specific and horrific outcomes.
How do you do that as a nation? Because it's really easy to say it, Carla, but how do you do it?
I think, a broader education of the entire population is of the state of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, of like the amazing things that we've talked about and the fantastic programs that are happening across this country. I think obviously in the current context, and Tanya can talk about this much more, we have an opportunity in the next few years to have a conversation as a nation about what we see for ourselves moving forward, what kind of country we want to be, and ensuring that, in that instance in particular, we have a constitution that reflects that. So that leading up to a referendum in the next few years gives us a chance to have that conversation as a nation and start to look at some of those broader solutions that go beyond just the pointy end of the stick with health and education, and start to look at holistic measures of addressing some of these systemic issues.
Tom, when we put out a question to our community asking them essentially what could be done to improve the situation of the Aboriginal community in Australia, the question of leadership in that community came up. If you take a look at my screen, Katie here says if the government wanted to make a change, they would consult with the grassroots rather than these so-called Indigenous leaders that our country has at the moment. So essentially blaming the government for not connecting with the right leaders. But we also have Didi who says what the community needs is an Aboriginal leader capable of taking the mass to the streets and shaking up the country for protesting against racism. So my question to you is there a lack of, is there not sufficient dynamic leadership in the community, or is the government not connecting with the right leaders?
Well, I think there's the first one is that, yes, there are many Aboriginal leaders across the nation, and but what we tend to have is that the government, and we heard the Prime Minister at the opening of Parliament again just the other day refer to one person who is identified as a leader, that the media in Australia continually pick on a handful of people and push them up as leaders. They do not represent the views of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They represent their own views, and they're not engaging with the leaders across the nation who can contribute. For example, I chair the Australian Indigenous Leadership Centre, and we've been training leaders for the past 12 years, and they're leaders who have succeeded in their communities, who are contributing back to their communities. They represent their communities, and yet governments and the media don't engage with those people at all, or enough of, but they get influenced very much by a handful of people, and literally it is a handful who they mount as leaders, and therefore they are influencing policy in Australia. And that's why very much I and others are advocating that we have to get down to the grassroots, or get down to the community level, be that a remote community or an urbanised community, and engage with people who have been elected to represent their people and present a view. And that's where the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples is such an important body, as a representative body. That's why the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is such an important document that we have to get the Australian government and the Australian people to understand a lot more, because that captures issues that need to be addressed, collective issues as Indigenous population groups.
All right, so Thomas, you've been speaking. Anthony has a very deep frown on his face. Your brow is so furrowed. I just have to ask you, Anthony, what's going on in your head? Why were you frowning so much?
I look like that 24/7. So it's not an indication of anything that's just happened.
Right.
Can I add, Femi? Can I add to what Tom said?
Yeah,
because it'd be helpful for people overseas that there's no pan-Aboriginal Australia. It's helpful to think of Aboriginal Australia as Europe. There were hundreds of different nations with different ideals. So there's, when you think of Aboriginal Australia, you've got to think more of Europe. You're not going to find Aboriginal people will support leaders from another nation easily. It's not that simple.
Sure. Okay, so here,
I think the question of leadership is a really important one in terms of the future as well. One of the things that I come up against a lot when I speak to young people about this idea of leadership is that they see what happens to our leaders. They see our leaders stand up to be counted, and they see our leaders cut down, and they see that happen, in the broader Australian context as well as in the Indigenous Australian context. And so I think we have a responsibility with such a young population to grow a generation or generations of connected leaders who are cognizant of that diversity and respectful of that diversity. And although they may have different views about the ways of going about things, there is a respect for there being enough space for leaders to exist with each other and support each other.
All right, I need all five of you to give me a moment of clarity, because I have to say we set this show up as in some of the Aboriginal communities in Australia there are issues with health, with education, and as Tanya pointed out, a whole lot of other things that we have to think about, and as Carla said, holistically. So that's how we set up the show. The question we asked at the very beginning was, is the future brighter for the Aboriginal population in Australia? I want you to give me something that clarifies that question. as we wrap up the show. So it's not going to be a long conversation, it's not going to be a speech, it's just going to give me some clarity. Chris.
No, I don't agree. I mean, Anthony mentioned earlier that part of Utopia was sensationalist. I can take you to literally hundreds and hundreds of Aboriginal communities that are suffering the same fate. And a lot of Australians don't like the reality in this country, but until we start embracing self-determination, then, and we're heading in the exact opposite direction, until Aboriginal people control Aboriginal lives, then no, I don't think things are optimistic at all. I think they're worse today than they were a decade ago.
Anthony.
Chris, can I clarify something on that? Yeah, look, thanks, mate, for that. Let me clarify what I said before. When I said sensationalist, what I meant was if you focus just on those bits, which nobody's in denial of,
well, the film doesn't
focus just picture. So it focuses on the good things as well. It focuses on 30,000 university graduates we've got.
No, it tells the true story of Aboriginal Australia, the history, and it's not pretty, Anthony. You might want to make it pretty, but it's not pretty, mate.
I agree, Chris. I'm not in denial. Chris, don't put ideas into me. I agree. There are some shocking
it's
bad
very
spots.
late in the day and in this program to be having a back and forth. We could have done it 20 minutes ago. So what I'm asking is for some clarity from you, Anthony.
Yeah. Okay. Look, there are bad bits and there are good bits, and we need to show both.
All right, Carla, clarity?
Is the future brighter? Yeah, I do believe that it is. I think as we see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people starting to move into every area of society and be successful in that area, whatever that area is and whatever they choose for themselves, we'll see more and more Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people coming along with them. It is a part of our nature, it is innate within us to bring our families and communities with us. So as we start to see that happen more and more, we'll see a brighter future.
Is the future brighter for the Aboriginal population in Australia? That's what I asked at the beginning of the show. Tanya, your personal answer?
My personal answer is that I have to believe it's possible. I don't know actually if it really is, but I have to believe it's possible. Otherwise, I would be paralysed and unable to try and do anything. I think that there are those of us who are able to really leverage some new opportunities that are arriving every day, but you know, the fact remains that there are some communities that are so disenfranchised, that are so run down, that are in those third world conditions, and it's up to those of us who do carry some privilege and opportunity to make sure that those stories aren't lost, because you know, they're the everyday experiences of people that are still, you know, I guess represent a national shame without doubt.
Sure. Tom Calma, you get the last word as far as the guests are concerned. We asked that about how optimistic the Aboriginal community happen to be in Australia. How would you respond to that?
I'm a glass half full person.
Good.
I think that we can look at optimism. If we looked at our first Indigenous university graduate was in the mid-60s, we now have hundreds of medical doctors, people with doctorates and higher degrees. We've got teachers, dentists, the whole works. We've seen massive improvements. We're seeing a number of our scholars now going internationally to study at Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and so forth. So there is that element of optimism there. I think what's really important to recognise, though, is that our population is not going to reach what the pre-colonised population until around about the 2020. By the most recent statistics show that by 2031 we will have over 1 million Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. It's almost doubling the current population. So the issues that we're confronting today are going to compound immensely if governments don't get involved, if our people don't get involved, and we're given the opportunities to take control of their lives, because we hold the solution, not governments, not the mass media. We as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have the solutions.
All right, you're listening to Tom Calma. Tom, thank you for being part of the programme. Also, thank you to Chris Graham as well, Carla McGrath, Anthony Dillon and Tanya Hosch. Thank you very much for giving us some insight into the issues around the Aboriginal communities in Australia, and finally with the community. Omar?
We have a general comment about the size of this problem and on what level it needs to be dealt with. Chesney Dennis says, social fabrics are made by the society. The government merely oversees it. So it's clearly something that the country as a whole has to work with.
Wow, this was a giant conversation.
Yes,
we did our best. The conversation will continue at AJ Stream. Meanwhile, what will we be tackling next? Well, the killing of a Nigerian man in India has fired up diplomatic tension between the two countries. Now, Nigerians say they face racism and discrimination in India, but Indian authorities blame the murder on local drug feuds. We'll have more on that tomorrow. Until then, we'll be online. Take care.